Jason Malone and Mrs. Lewis never imagined their paths would collide in a battle that would shake the quiet town of Millridge. But when a fearless neighbor meets a ruthless bully, the consequences turn deadly serious, and karma comes with a force no one saw coming. In the quiet town of Millridge, Jason the Bull Malone quickly became a name that carried weight, though not the kind anyone wanted. From the moment he entered high school, he seemed to radiate an aura of intimidation. He was taller than most of his classmates, with a stocky build that made even the bravest students think twice before crossing him. His piercing eyes held a cold, calculating look, and his smirk seemed to suggest that no one could ever challenge him. What made Jason dangerous wasn't just his size. It was the way he enjoyed asserting power over others. Small acts of cruelty became his daily routine. He shoved students in hallways, took lunch money from those who couldn't fight back, and whispered humiliating lies about anyone who showed even a hint of vulnerability. Teachers tried to discipline him, but Jason was clever. He twisted every encounter to his advantage, playing the role of the misunderstood teen when authority looked too closely. Parents warned their children to stay away, hoping distance would protect them, but it never did. At home, Jason came from a family that, on the surface, appeared respectable. They had money, a nice house on the edge of town, and connections that seemed to shield Jason from the full force of consequences. But behind closed doors, there were whispers of deceit. His parents indulged him, excusing misbehavior as a phase or attributing it to youthful energy. This indulgence gave Jason a false sense of invincibility. He began to believe that he could manipulate anyone, that no action was too bold, no boundary too firm to cross. At school, he noticed patterns in the way people responded to fear, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. Bullies were supposed to be feared, and Jason knew exactly how to make fear stick. Even outside school, his influence spread. Neighborhood kids, once carefree, learned to avoid the streets he roamed. If anyone dared to resist, they faced swift retaliation, taunts, physical intimidation, or worse, property damage. Adults occasionally tried to step in, but Jason was always one step ahead. He laughed in the face of rules, moving through town like a shadow that couldn't be caught. In his mind, the world was his playground, and everyone else was simply a piece of scenery to be manipulated or crushed under his feet. Yet beneath the bravado, cracks were beginning to appear in Jason's carefully constructed image. Some people noticed inconsistencies in his stories, subtle signs that not everything he claimed was true. Rumors about stolen money and dishonest dealings started circulating quietly among townsfolk. No one could confront him openly yet, but unease began to ripple through the community. Even as Jason strutted through the halls and streets, seemingly untouchable, small seeds of suspicion and doubt began to grow. Unseen by him, the town was watching. While he laughed and flexed his dominance, the foundations of his untouchable persona were quietly starting to shift, laying the groundwork for a reckoning he had never anticipated. Jason's reign of fear continued to grow, moving far beyond the hallways of Millridge High. He no longer limited himself to classmates or neighbors. He targeted anyone who seemed even slightly vulnerable. Local shopkeepers learned quickly that a polite refusal could invite weeks of harassment. Shelves were knocked over, goods were stolen, and false complaints were spread about those who dared to confront him. His bullying became more calculated, his attacks more aggressive, and his confidence in evading consequences grew with each incident. At first, the town treated his actions as youthful mischief, a phase that would eventually pass. But the pattern was too consistent, too deliberate, and the damage was escalating. One afternoon, an incident in the town square shocked even those who had grown accustomed to Jason's cruelty. A small group of kids had been playing quietly near the fountain when Jason approached, demanding they move. When they refused, he knocked over their toys and pushed one of the children to the ground. The crowd that gathered whispered among themselves, anger simmering beneath the surface, yet no one intervened. Fear held them back. Jason thrived on this silence. Every act of intimidation reinforced his belief that the town was powerless against him, that no one could or would stop him. But quietly, a few eyes were watching and taking note. One former classmate, who had endured years of Jason's torment, began documenting each incident. Photographs were taken, notes were written, and a pattern of harassment began to emerge. Each report became a small piece of evidence, a record of wrongdoing that Jason assumed he had buried under fear and silence. Yet even as the town seemed paralyzed by his presence, these small efforts were planting the first seeds of accountability. Jason's arrogance grew in tandem with his actions. He became reckless, believing himself untouchable not only in the eyes of the town, but in the eyes of the law. This belief led him to escalate his behavior. He started forging checks, taking items from local stores without paying, and manipulating friends and neighbors into covering for him. Each act of deceit was a test of how far he could push the limits. He enjoyed the thrill of walking so close to punishment without ever feeling its weight. Then came the first real warning. An anonymous tip reached the local police department. The message was concise but alarming, detailing Jason's harassment and hinting at financial crimes that went beyond petty theft. Officers attempted to follow up, but Jason's careful lies and charm allowed him to evade serious scrutiny. Still, the tip marked a turning point. The authorities, once indifferent, now had a reason to look closer. Jason, unaware of the growing threat, continued his campaign of intimidation, unaware that the walls he thought were impenetrable were quietly closing in. As the town watched, fear began to mix with a quiet, simmering hope. Victims who had suffered in silence now realized that someone was documenting Jason's misdeeds. The first signs of resistance appeared not through confrontation, but through careful observation and preparation. The once untouchable bully remained confident, yet the first cracks in his armor were forming. In the shadows of his own arrogance, karma was beginning to stir, preparing to challenge the dominance he had long assumed was absolute. Jason's arrogance continued to grow as he roamed Millridge with a sense of invincibility. He believed no one could challenge him, and for a while that belief seemed justified. His intimidation was so precise that even adults often looked the other way, unwilling to confront the storm he created. Yet, amid his reign, a quiet figure had begun to emerge, a neighbor named Mrs. Lewis, whose life had been shaped by observing others and learning patience. She had noticed Jason's behavior for years, cataloging each instance of cruelty from a distance. Unlike most of the town, she did not fear him. She understood the power of careful strategy and patience. Slowly, she began gathering evidence, taking notes of incidents, and organizing information from victims who had been too scared to speak. Jason never noticed her. He was too wrapped up in his own schemes and the thrill of control. He continued harassing classmates, stealing from shops, and spreading false rumors about those who dared oppose him. He assumed everyone was too weak to resist. Yet Mrs. Lewis quietly coordinated with the victims, advising them on how to document incidents properly, guiding them toward recording evidence that would eventually expose his actions. The town, once passive, began to see a glimmer of hope in her quiet determination. The most surprising development came from within Jason's own circle. One of his closest friends, someone he trusted implicitly, had grown tired of covering for him and watching the harm he caused. This friend had secretly been collecting information on Jason's illegal activities, from petty theft to forged documents. It was a betrayal Jason never anticipated. He had always believed that loyalty protected him, that his friends would shield him from consequences. Now, without warning, the walls he thought were unbreakable were quietly closing in. Mrs. Lewis and the friend formed an unspoken alliance, sharing their evidence and organizing it meticulously. Surveillance photos, receipts, eyewitness accounts, and even social media posts painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The victims, once paralyzed by fear, began to find strength in this growing network of accountability. Jason's actions, previously hidden behind intimidation and silence, were finally being revealed in full detail. Meanwhile, Jason continued to escalate his tactics, oblivious to the quiet storm gathering against him. He believed that his power was absolute, that fear alone would protect him. But each reckless act was adding to the mountain of evidence being prepared. The town's perception of him was beginning to shift subtly. People who had once been terrified were now cautiously optimistic, realizing that the bully might finally face repercussions. In the shadows, the pieces of Jason's undoing were falling into place. The quiet patience of Mrs. Lewis, combined with the unexpected betrayal of his friend, set the stage for a reckoning he could neither see nor prevent. Every intimidation, every stolen item, every cruel act that had once seemed untouchable was now documented, creating a web that would eventually ensnare him. Jason's arrogance blinded him to the inevitability of the consequences building quietly around him. Unseen and unstoppable, karma was preparing to strike, drawing the threads of justice closer with every passing day. Jason's sense of invincibility reached its peak one stormy evening when he decided to target a new family that had recently moved into Millridge. Unlike the other residents he had tormented, this family refused to show fear. They had been warned about him by neighbors and had taken careful precautions. Jason, fueled by arrogance and frustration at meeting resistance for the first time in years, saw their defiance as a challenge to his authority. Determined to assert dominance, he planned an attack that he believed would intimidate them completely. That night, he approached their property, confident that his usual tactics of intimidation, vandalism, and threats would work. The new family, however, was prepared. They had installed cameras and kept detailed records of any suspicious activity. As Jason vandalized their yard, knocking over fences and damaging property, every moment was being recorded. The arrogance that had protected him for so long became his downfall. Unaware of the surveillance, Jason committed each act with reckless confidence, believing that fear alone would keep him safe from consequences. The next morning, the footage from the cameras made its way to the local authorities, along with reports compiled by Mrs. Lewis and the brave victims who had been documenting his actions for months. What had once been a string of isolated incidents now appeared as a clear pattern of harassment, intimidation, and criminal behavior. Police officers reviewed the evidence in detail, shocked by the scope and persistence of Jason's actions. It was undeniable. He had crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. The town, which had long been paralyzed by fear, watched as the story unfolded. Each act of cruelty Jason had committed was now visible in clear, undeniable detail. The former friend who had secretly gathered proof provided crucial information about financial crimes, including theft and forged documents, adding a new layer to the case. The web of wrongdoing that Jason had carefully constructed to appear untouchable was unraveling before his eyes. The legal process began swiftly. Jason was arrested and charged with multiple counts of harassment, theft, and property damage. Court documents revealed every act of intimidation and cruelty he had carried out over the years, each carefully documented by those he had tormented. The townspeople, once witnesses to his unchecked reign, now saw the full extent of his actions laid bare. His reputation, built on fear and arrogance, crumbled under the weight of truth. Even as he faced the consequences, Jason struggled to understand how his world had collapsed so quickly. The allies he had once counted on turned against him. The victims he had believed powerless had become instruments of justice, and the quiet determination of a single neighbor had brought months of careful preparation to fruition. The bully who had ruled Millridge with fear was now powerless, confronted with a reality he could no longer control. Karma, which had been quietly gathering in the shadows, had struck with precision, exposing every misdeed, and ensuring that the arrogance and cruelty that had once seemed untouchable were met with inevitable consequences. Jason Malone's downfall was swift and absolute. In the weeks following his arrest, the town of Millridge witnessed a transformation that no one had anticipated. The fear that had once hung over the streets like a thick fog began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. Jason, who had thrived on the intimidation of others, was now stripped of his power. The legal system moved methodically, and every act of harassment, theft, and manipulation he had committed was documented and presented with undeniable clarity. Judges and juries were faced with a pattern of behavior that left little room for doubt. The evidence, collected by victims, neighbors, and even his own former friend, revealed a man who had built his life on cruelty and deceit. Sentencing brought further shock to the town. Jason was ordered to perform extensive community service, repay damages to those he had wronged, and adhere to strict probation conditions. For someone who had once believed that rules and consequences could never touch him, this was a humbling reality. The very people he had tormented now had the satisfaction of seeing justice served. Victims, once silenced by fear, experienced a sense of closure as the court validated their suffering. The town, too, felt a collective exhale, as though the weight of years of tension had finally been lifted. Life in Millridge began to heal. Streets once avoided out of fear became safe again. Children played without hesitation. Shopkeepers reopened their stores without anxiety, and neighbors returned to a sense of normalcy. Mrs. Lewis, whose quiet determination had been instrumental in exposing Jason, continued to watch over the community, ensuring that the lessons of the past were not forgotten. The network of victims and allies who had documented his actions grew closer, bound together by the shared experience of confronting cruelty and witnessing its consequences. The most striking aspect of Jason's fall was the irony of his situation. He had spent years mocking others for weakness, for fear, for obedience to rules, yet he now found himself trapped under the scrutiny of those very qualities. His arrogance, which had once been his greatest strength, had blinded him to the inevitability of consequences. Every act of intimidation, every stolen dollar, every cruel lie became a piece of the chain that held him accountable. Karma, patient and precise, had ensured that every misdeed was exposed. In the aftermath, the town reflected on the events that had unfolded. Millridge had been changed forever, not just by the actions of a single bully, but by the courage and persistence of those who refused to remain silent. Jason's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that power built on fear is fragile, and that even the most untouchable individuals are vulnerable when patience, evidence, and courage converge. As for Jason, he faced the long, quiet days of reflection, stripped of his dominance, and confronted with the reality that no matter how big a bully becomes, karma has a way of catching up, often in ways that are both inevitable and just.